like to recognize Sandy Langer, who went to City College with my mom, so this goes back to 1950 or so. And Jerry Berlin, who was my father's roommate at what was then Lowell Tech in 1951, and saw my father start to date my mother. So I'd also like to welcome the Newton North class of 1975 to their reunion, and a number of folks from Amherst College, from Owens Crowd, as well as everyone, lots of folks from the neighborhood, and really appreciate you being here. It's hard to know what tone to take with my mother. Do I be irreverent and tell you that we went to the cemetery this morning to look at her grave, and my daughter pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and we all lit up and took a puff in her honor? Someone has inherited some of her independence and forcefulness, very happily. So thank you all for coming to honor, remember, and celebrate my mother, Jean Schmidt. In the last 5 days, I've received many emails about my mother. My cousin Helen from Australia, herself the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, wrote, "I remember your mother in her kitchen, cigarette in mouth, spectacles dangling on her chest, head over a pot of something fragrant, stirring and talking and smoking seemingly at the same time. Jean was powerfully alive, wonderfully energetic, and full of thoughts. I have not met many people like her. She was of her generation and of her time." Her daughter-in-law, Ruthie Titel, wrote me, "Jean was an extraordinary woman of valor. She experienced more than anyone's fair share of heartache and loss. And yet throughout, she never lost her compass, her energy for her family, her commitment to the Jewish community internationally and beyond." Food, family, conversation, a contingent of relatives and friends from around the world, a warm and inviting home, Jewish identity, commitment, causes. What more needs to be said? With my mother, plenty. All of you knew some part of my mother's dynamism, from mother of 3 sons to her teaching Spanish at Boston College, writing textbooks, her love of 100 Years of Solitude, the stories of Borges in Latin American literature, and her travels to Latin and South America. She took trips with family and relatives and groups to many other parts of the world. Recently, she remarked she regretted she had missed the opportunity to go down the Amazon with the dear friend of her, Michael Wine. She loved the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Buñuel and Fellini, because someone had to expose the students to culture when she ran a film series at Boston College. She loved cooking and baking and hosting dinners, doing it most of herself because she did not train her 3 sons well. She spent weeks preparing food for each of our bar mitzvah parties at Waverly Ave. My mother did not like that house on Waverly Avenue at first. It was too big. She grew to like it. She made her imprints with her decorative sense. Pardon me. So she grew to like it. She made her imprints with her decorative sense of bright colors, wall hangings, and items collected from her trips. You could see that distinctive sense of style again in her condo. She had a huge collection of serving dishes, often collected on her trips, that reflected her bold aesthetic. She did not have many close relatives, especially on her father's side, because of the Holocaust. My mother made the remaining cousins distant on the genealogical tree, close whether they were in California, Israel, or Australia. We were together as 4 generations at a wedding in Italy 2.5 years ago, my mother's last hurrah, a 3rd trip to Europe with my daughter, Isabel. In her retirement, she continued to travel, belonged to book groups, supported progressive Israeli causes, politics through J Street, translated at Children's Hospital, which was difficult for her because she took license in a way that she thought would be helpful, and the staff did not. She took and gave classes at Brandeis Adult Learning Institute. From my suburban upbringing in Newton, I took a long time to appreciate my mother's early life and experiences. Her mother, Helen, was born in Russia. The family fled the pogroms and came to the States through Shanghai. I don't know the year. Helen was an elderly spinster of 29 in August of 1929 when she visited a sister who had settled in Dresden. Helen met my grandfather, Oscar. I have photos of him in his stylish knickers skiing, stylish knickers hiking, stylish knickers, a white shirt and tie, playing tennis. Oscar was part of an artistic and intellectual community. Oscar and Helen married, and my mother was born in Dresden in December 1932. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany the next year. Helen, my grandmother, a woman of little schooling and great intelligence, had to return to the States to maintain her U.S. citizenship, so the story goes that I know. Helen had to give my grandfather Oscar an ultimatum to come with her and their child. With reluctance, Oscar left the vibrant life in Dresden to come to Chicago. He left Germany early in the rise of Nazism. Many of the relatives and friends from that Dresden community were not so prescient and did not survive. My grandfather Oscar found work in the German Jewish community in Chicago. My mother said they moved every couple of years as her father's position improved. My mother was 5 years old when her brother Jordan was born, and in trying to compare notes of what Jordan and my mother's experiences were like, totally different stories. So as I say, I qualify, this is how I know it. But Oscar was an adventurer. He discovered the Southwest through his work and early travels in the States. He loved it. And in the summer of 1946, when my mother was 13, Oscar moved the family to Phoenix, Arizona. At that time, Phoenix had a population of about 80,000 people. It's not the sprawling metropolis we know of it now. It was a cow town. My mother started high school and joined the Zionist youth group. Oscar was diagnosed with cancer shortly after they arrived in Phoenix and died in December that year. 6 days before my mother's 14th birthday. My grandmother Helen, my mother, and her brother Jordan stayed in Phoenix for the rest of my mother's time in high school. They lived in a 2-bedroom house. He rented a room to a man from the German Jewish community in Phoenix who had known Oscar. My mother slept in the small living room. Nonetheless, my mother had fond memories of Phoenix and picnics in the desert with the youth group. The 3 of them moved to New York City the summer of 1950 to be near some of Helen's family. I try to imagine that transition for my 17-year-old mother, moving from the small, slow, low-slung city town of Phoenix to New York City. The 3 of them lived in a small apartment. My grandmother that fall started City College of New York, majoring in English, worked at a department store, and did her homework in the bathroom late at night to avoid disturbing the 2 others when she got home from work. I imagine those lean years when she was 14 to 20 were formative to shape her self-reliance, her self-sufficiency, frugality, and attention to grammar. She met my father Bernard, a handsome Argentine, when they were 19 and 20, and married the following year. She escaped a cramped apartment. For their honeymoon, they drove a wood-paneled station wagon to Mexico. A few years later, 1956, they traveled by ship to Europe and Israel. They moved to Argentina in 1957 with the intention that my father would join the family textile business. Owen was born there. My father had an extensive family with 18 aunts and uncles and over first cousins. The family was overwhelming, and my father did not like his boss, his father. So they ended up returning to the Boston area in 1960. My father's family was an endless source of stories for my mother that could have come from Garcia Marquez's Magic Realism, with about 7 aunts, all named Sarita, and 8 uncles, all named David. So genealogy, identifying them was part of that Garcia Marquez Magic Realism. She did not know how formative her time in Argentina would be to her career, identity, and identity. My mother remained close to parts of my father's family in Argentina after their divorce. She returned many times, and they visited her in Newton and Brookline. There was a lot that my mother loved about the Latin culture, just not the machismo. My father did not understand the assertiveness training that my mother did as part of the early feminist movement in the 1970s. He did not understand the humor or the irony in the white mug printed with black pigs, MCP written underneath, male chauvinist pig, that my mother used to serve him coffee after dinner each night when he was home. As Ruthie noted, my mother experienced heartache and loss. Her adolescence was marked by losing her father, living in difficult circumstances as an adolescent, and then enduring a difficult and unhappy marriage, all of which was a prelude to losing Owen in 1991 when she was 58 years old. Owen shared my mother's energy, warmth, and ability to attract special people. Owen was forever bringing friends to the house. One of his high school buddies and friends to today wrote, "I remember raiding the bottomless refrigerator. The cold cuts, pickles, fruits, and other foods were in mammoth abundance, and when six friends were over, we barely made a dent. Your mother loved to watch us eat and kibitz in that inviting kitchen of yours." My mother fostered many communities, many of them related to Owen, and continued after his death. Owen brought people from Amherst College for the holidays. He found every stray Jew from Latin and South America, so Passover Seders could extend with new versions of Haggadah, with new melodies and tempos. A number of Nepalis had their first Thanksgivings at my mother's dining room table. On short notice, my mother could prepare a wonderful meal for a dozen people, and each person knew they had a place to eat thereafter. Chicken Marbella from the Silver Palate Cookbook, fabulous sauteed broccoli with a touch of soy sauce splashed on at the end, ginger cheesecake, chocolate cheesecake, Congo bars, anything from her bundt pans, the flourless chocolate cake, chocolate torte at Passover. She was a feminist and loves hosting. She had a poster from New Balance on her wall for many years, a little old lady with her one leg up against the wall. A picture, and with the caption saying, "Growing old is not for sissies." She remained stubbornly independent until about 90, living the best life she could in her wonderful apartment in Coolidge Corner. It was the reality of the end that she could not prepare for or accept. My mother most valued her intelligence, her presence, and her vanity. She refused hearing aids, canes, walkers, and oxygen because she was afraid they would mark her as less than whole. They would be like a neon sign flashing vulnerability that happened to other old people, but not Jean Cooper Schmidt. We had discussions over the years of what to do. She had thought the end would come in a definitive way, with a bang, like cancer. Although when she did have lung cancer and a lobectomy, she proudly and defiantly, given her years of smoking, said, "I got the kind that does not kill you." And she still snuck cigarettes as though we didn't know, the smell in her apartment after that. And one of her partners in crime is with us now. From her experience with her mother, who had the steady loss of personhood from dementia, my mother was clear that she did not want to be one of those people endlessly repeating herself with dementia, suffering the slow decay. She chose to move to Newbridge for a number of reasons that made sense. To be closer to other people right after the isolating time of COVID, to downsize from a grand apartment that was too much to manage, to be able to transition to higher levels of care if needed, not that she could imagine needing assistance or accepting it. She declared that no one would live with her in her apartment, which was actually a big factor in her decision to move. I'm not going to have anyone living here. What are you talking about? She moved with service to serve 16, as though the old ways would continue. Shortly after she arrived at Newbridge, she realized, she thought she made a big mistake because she found it full of old people, a geriatric ghetto, people with hearing aids and walkers, not to mention memory loss. Her memory loss had been evident for some time before she moved. She had little idea of how much she repeated herself. On walks during my visits here, she would point out each elderly person, and in her piercing sotto voce, turn to me and say, "I know I'm losing it, but don't tell anyone. It isn't apparent, is it?" Until we saw the next person, and the same sentence would come out. I assured her her secret was safe with me, that neither Debbie or her cousin Debbie or other folks noticed that she was repeating herself. She would have been appalled to see the circularity of conversations that started with asking about the grandchildren, spewing against Trump, and then asking, "So tell me about the grandchildren," as though she hadn't just heard it 2 minutes ago. My mother was very sensitive to class or money, usually noting people who she perceived had more than she did. From shortly after her arrival to Newbridge, she spoke about the larger units in independent living, the villas, the cottages, or the neighbor who had the duplex right near her. My mother continued in independent living in a beautiful apartment, well appointed as you can imagine from her, until June of this year. She didn't quite realize that she'd moved to the nursing home unit. She would tell me when I visited, in that knowing tone, almost as if sharing knowledge of a conspiracy, that her single room showed she was now in the poor section at Newbridge. They placed us poor people in little rooms. My cousin Debbie offered the interpretation that in my mother's mind, she was returning to the poverty of her adolescence. For my mother, thinking she was poor was probably easier than acknowledging her decline, her frailty, the memory loss, the decay. My mother latched onto 3 literary references after she moved to Newbridge. Multiple times in each call or visit, each time as though she were expressing a new realization, a novel thought, she would turn to me and say, "You know that novel by Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain? That is what it's like here. Pleasant enough, but every day is the same, indistinguishable. The passage of time stops." She left unsaid the fate of many of the guests at the sanitarium, the slow decay and the helplessness against it. Then she would segue to Dylan Thomas. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age, burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." My mother raged. Finally, there was the end of a certain poem. "The world will end, the world will end, the world will end, not with a bang, but a whimper." T.S. Eliot, that anti-Semite. I think that anti-Semite was the poet's last name. She always said that anti-Semite. In time, her references to Magic Mountain and Dylan Thomas slowed and stopped. The fragments became shorter. The world will end, not with a bang, but a whimper. T.S. Eliot, that anti-Semite. Later, there were times on her days when she was having difficulty, she would say, not with a bang, but a whimper, that anti-Semite. And if I supplied T.S. Eliot, she would brighten and remark, oh, you know the poem also? And then she would tell me to tell her what the grandchildren are up to, as though we hadn't discussed that twice already. My mother raged at the injustice that Owen's life ended with a bang far too early, and hers with a whimper too late. In September 2017, my mother took Isabel to Dresden on a special program sponsored by the city of Dresden to bring back those who had to flee the Nazis. A last opportunity to circle back to her beginning. Isabel met amazing people, saw incredible and horrific sights, including Slaughterhouse-Five, and went to the Magnificent Opera in Dresden with my mother. On the last night there, they saw a demonstration on the streets. My mother asked a young man what was happening. This is the weekly march of the neo-Nazis. Today, 8 years later, the rise of anti-Semitism is increasing, not decreasing. My mother invited that young man out to dinner, because he was a handsome young man, with Isabel and herself. And in my mother's words, because she never made it onto social media, Isabel and Moritz became pen pals. She's still wanting to set you up, you know? On March 20th, the Owen Kupferschmidt Holocaust and Human Rights Project at BC Law School will mark the 85th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials with a special event to tie the past to the present. Bill Mandel, co-founder of the project with him, wrote, "Your mother was always focused, committed, active, and inquisitive, and full of warmth and laughter. When Owen was starting the Holocaust and Human Rights Project, every year she would welcome all of the Boston College law students, panelists, and conference attendees to your Newton home for food, engagement, and dialogue. After losing Owen, she was the core energizer for the law school, the faculty, and many generations of students and outside supporters to keep the Holocaust and Human Rights Project going. Because of her, the Holocaust and Human Rights Project is still here 40 years after Owen founded it. On our last call, she told me Owen was lucky that I was his friend. I would say we were all lucky to have had Jean Kupferschmidt as our friend. My mother lamented the loneliness of old age, when family does not live close, grandchildren are doing their things, friends stop driving out to Dedham, or have the audacity to die before her. I would like to recognize two special people who stuck with my mother to the end. Debbie Roosh, a colleague from Boston College, has been a dear friend to my mother for over 30 years. She was always present at her apartment on Beacon Street and now here at Newbridge. When I failed my mother by not keeping her supplied with the nicotine lozenges, Debbie stepped in as my mother's dealer. Hey Jean, I got some 2 milligrammers for you. My mother loved Debbie, even though she's from Wisconsin and does not read the New York Times every day. You can ask Debbie about that one. In the spirit of my mother not wanting anything to go to waste, Debbie, I've got some last of the nicotine to give back to you. Sally Fleshner met my mother too late for them to go on adventures together, but they would have been scary partners with their energy and intensity. Last Tuesday, I called Sally to say my mother was very ill. Sally said, "But I just saw her Friday, and this morning I was signing her up for classes at Brandeis." She can't do that. Die, that is. She can't do that while I'm signing her up. Sally was my mother's intellectual lifeline. She told me what book to order each month for the book club and made sure that my mother attended the meetings. Sally brought her the New York Times book review each week. Debbie and Sally made my mother's life immeasurably better in those last years. Thank you very much.